Hi friends, welcome to Growing as GrownUps, where we believe each of us has the opportunity to keep growing in ways that can fundamentally improve our life effectiveness, our leadership influence, and our well-being. Through interviews, stories, and practical principles, we explore how you can accelerate your growth and unlock your potential to make the difference you want to make. And now, your hosts from the Leaders Lyceum, Dr. Sarah Musgrove and Dr. Keith Eigel.
Ambassador Andrew Young, welcome to the Growing as GrownUps podcast. Personally, on behalf of our audience, I just want to thank you for spending time with us today and sharing some of your wisdom, perhaps about how you've grown over the years yourself, but also your take on how we all perhaps can keep growing to make better sense of this world that just seems increasingly polarized. Early this year, you officially entered your 9th decade. I don't know if you've thought about it like that yet. I know you're coming up on your 90th, and I hope that's okay to say. It's congratulations from my perspective.
Well, thank you.
With all the experiences you have had, I'd love to ask you kind of a big overarching question just to kind of start this off. What has become more true to you from the perspective that you have sitting here with us today?
What's that?
What has become more true to you? What just as you reflect back over the years, as you're sitting here today, what has become more true to you about yourself, the world, the situation we're in, hope, whatever it might be?
Well, I've never thought of it that way, more true to me. One of the things I'm extremely anxious about for this particular period in life, not my life, but I've always been grounded in truth. And
bless you.
Excuse me.
Bless you.
From childhood, there was just right and wrong. There was truth and falsehood. I guess I was about 19 when I finished college, and it's the nearest thing I've had to a religious experience, and it was nothing particularly religious about it. I was running in North Carolina, and I was running downhill slightly, which made me run too fast. And I came to the foot of Kings Mountain and decided I was going to push myself to the top. And I did. And I was in very good condition. I'd been on the track team and the swimming team in college. So I was really in shape all year round. But I pushed myself to the top of that mountain, and I almost blacked out. I couldn't breathe. And I was heaving and for breath. And I think I took my shirt off and laid it on a rock to dry because I was wringing wet. And when I opened my eyes and looked around, the first time in my life, I saw the world differently. And I don't know what it was, but I saw everything with a purpose. I saw the sky. I saw the trees. I saw the cornfields. I saw the animals. Everything I saw, I knew that someone had put it there for a purpose. And it just hit me that if everything I see from the top of this mountain, I see with a purpose, then whoever made the mountain and the sky and the trees also made me. And that there's got to be a purpose for me. And I didn't know what it was.
Yeah.
And I almost didn't care. But I felt like I had wasted my college time. Mostly because I spent the time rebelling against the fact that I didn't want to be a dentist as my father was. And I knew from the very beginning I was not going to dental school and I was not going to be a dentist. My father was such a strong influence that I didn't have the strength to tell it. That was the moment I decided that I didn't know what I was to be. But if God put everything else that I could see, as far as I could see, everything had a purpose. And I could figure out that purpose. There had to be a purpose for me.
Wow.
And I didn't need to know what it was. I needed to just look within me to see where I was being led.
Wow.
And that the truth that was to set me free. Well, later on, I read Tolstoy, The Kingdom of God is Within You. And I ended up going to a theological seminary where a number of my professors were Quakers, and they talked about the inner light. But I developed a concept of that everything is created by God in the image of God for the purposes of God. And the purpose of life was to discover just what your purpose was.
Wow.
And you couldn't find it out. I mean, I couldn't predict the future. I couldn't seek the future. I just had to do this one day at a time.
Yeah.
And that if each day I understood what was my purpose today, it would unfold to me throughout the rest of my life. And
Wow.
that's what's happened.
Yeah.
And so the concept of truth was something that was within each and every human being, that we're all created in the image of God. And that well, I've never tried to define it. All I had to do was obey it.
And that led you on quite a journey.
Well, it really did, because I came down from the mountain, and for the first time in a long time, I felt perfectly at peace.
Yeah.
See, because when I ran to the top of the mountain, I was feeling very guilty about having a college degree and not knowing anything. And I knew that I didn't know anything. And when I said I didn't know anything, I had passed biology and I'd passed chemistry, and I took all the required courses and did okay. But I hadn't even thought about the meaning of life until I got to the top of that mountain. And from then on, it was almost like I reversed the script, that you don't find your life and then seek your meaning. You find your meaning in life, and then you seek the direction of your life. It comes, instead of deciding on a career and then having that shape you, you figure out where God is leading you and why you were created, and it unfolds for you one day at a time.
Yeah.
And then
I'm sorry.
My life has really done that. I mean, when I got home, we had a new minister, and he just graduated from Yale Divinity School, and he was going out to Texas to a conference to do a Bible study. And he was from Indiana and had never been south before. And he asked me would I drive with him. And I drove with him, thinking that he was going out in West Texas. And I said, well, I can drop him off there. And my roommate was in San Antonio, and I can go down and spend the week with my roommate. But I had no intention of spending a week in any kind of religious conference. But when this was 1951, and we drove from the time when we drove from New Orleans to Houston, and from the time we left Houston, driving up toward the panhandle of Texas, we didn't see another Black person. And he was very nervous, and it made me nervous. And when we got to this church conference, we were the only Black people there. Well, in the 50s, that was very unusual. Yeah. See, and these were all kids from Texas and Oklahoma, all from segregationist backgrounds, all coming to tell me and him that if their parents knew they were there with Black people, they would probably disown them. See, and I said, well, why are you here? And they said, because this is what I think Jesus would have me do. Hmm. And so I'd never met people like that. And I ended up not going to San Antonio, but staying there. And there was a pretty heavy push. First, my pastor, who didn't want to be the only Black person there. And then the staff from New York saying that these young people had never known anybody Black as an equal. And this was the first time that they'd had any experience with somebody of another race. And that wasn't unusual for me, because I grew up in a neighborhood that, as I said, there was an Irish grocery store on one corner. There was an Italian bar. The headquarters of the Nazi Party was on the third corner. And I mean, it was the German-American Bund, and they were Highland Hitler. And I grew up in the middle of the block. And so I think I was 4 years old when, and I only know because it was 1936. And my father, in walking past the German-American Bund, explained to me that, Carolyn, can you close the door for me? I will. Okay, thanks. That
1936, your dad explained to you, and I've heard
this. That he said yes. That these people are white supremacists. Now, you have learned in Sunday school that God created a one blood, all the nations of the world. And he said, you remember that? I said, sure. He said, they don't believe that. They think that there's something superior about being white. He said, but that's a sickness. And you don't get angry with sick people, and you don't argue with them. You can't try to convince them. They have to grow into the same kind of awareness you have. And
wow.
He said, you can help. And he took me to see Jesse Owens in the Olympics, in the movies. And when Jesse won the 100-meter dash, Hitler walked out and took all of his stormtroopers. He was supposed to put the medal around Jesse Owens' neck, and he refused. And my father said, but Jesse was there to perform for his, and he did not let Hitler's problem distract him. That was Hitler's problem. He just concentrated on what his message was and his mission was, and he won 3 more gold medals.
Yeah.
And he introduced the slogan to me, you don't get mad in a struggle. And he said, don't get mad, get smart. That when you lose your temper, the blood rushes from your head. And he said, but where you want your blood, your mind is your most powerful weapon. And he said, he said, yes, the blood will rush from your head to your fist and your feet. He said, but you won't feel good about fighting or running. See? And whereas if you can stay calm and you can think your way through it, you're in a much stronger position. And so that's the way I was raised, to understand truth and power, uh, and also social change.
Hmm.
That that you don't get angry at sick people. He was a dentist, and everybody else in the neighborhood, there were several black families, but none of them had children, and it was just a working class neighborhood. We were probably the best off in the sense that my parents were probably the only two college graduates of the families there. Uh, and white people wouldn't come to him in the daytime to get their teeth fixed, but they'd call at night, come by at night and knock on the door when the teeth were hurting very badly. And he said, I could give them an excuse and let them suffer. He said, but he said, my tradition and my practice is to relieve suffering and to help people. And he said, yes, he said, if they'd come to me 2 weeks before, I could have probably done something that would have been less damaging to their teeth. See, or I could have prevented the infection. And he said, but I have chosen to help people when I can, as long as I can.
What an upbringing! What a way to be shaped during your formative years. We work in the field of developmental psychology. How do people keep growing as grown-ups? How does their understanding of the world in which they interact change? And these formative experiences have such an impact on us early. But
he was like, for instance, he showed me a bar of soap. He said, "You see this soap? So this is Irish soap. It's 99 and 44/100% pure." He said, "You can't get by like that." He said, "Irish soap is white, and you're black. If you ever cutting corners, even a tenth of a percent," he said, you're vulnerable. He said, "You have to be 100%, and you can't afford to shade the truth, or you can't afford." He said, "There is right and there's wrong, and you have to always be in 100% right. And if you're not, like I can remember him, we were going to the movies, and he ran the stop sign. Well, he didn't run the stop sign, but it was a shift car, and instead of going all the way back to first, he just went from third to second. He slowed down, almost came to a stop, but not a complete stop. And the policeman caught him. And the policeman, tried to give him every way excuse to say that when he saw his license and it said Dr. Young, he said, "Are you on the way to the hospital, doctor?" He said, "No, I'm taking my family to the movie." And I mean, he just refused to compromise. And I don't remember whether the guy gave him a ticket or not, but I can remember my mother fussing with him about, "Why didn't you just tell him we were going to the hospital?" And he said, "Because to shade the truth is to put my honor and sense of dignity on the line in front of my boys." And he said, "I don't ever want them to do that, so I shouldn't do that." And so he was raised like that by his father.
Yeah, but what a privilege to have someone like that shaping you. And it's sometimes hard to see that until you have a mountaintop experience when you're 19 years old and you decide that, all of that stuff comes into play. One of the reasons, if I could shift just a little bit, one of the reasons that I've so longed to have you on the podcast, to just have a conversation with you, is that all of these things that you've done, Howard University, ordained minister, one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement, the SCLC, congressman, ambassador to the United Nations, mayor of Atlanta, building schools, streets named in your honor. But for me, you are one of the truest living examples of someone who is able to rise above the fray. In my 3 years that I spent working at Morehouse, there's division in every organization in some way or another. But when you spoke, you're always able to elevate things above the divide, above the perspectives. And I mean, I got to see it in action. When it's interesting, in Easy Burden, your autobiography, you said working with people and representing people to help them better understand their condition is what I had come to consider my gift. And I'm wondering, this rising above the fray, the ability to hold a position but put yourself above the position. Do you see this in yourself?
Well, I sort of attach it to my concept of God. I mean, what I think happened to me on the top of that mountain was what say Tolstoy and Gandhi and Martin Luther King, people who found the meaning of their lives in the spiritual aspects of their life, not necessarily the physical. I mean, Martin was a preacher, was a very good preacher, but I don't think he ever thought of himself as a preacher. You know, he thought of himself as a servant of God. And he was very close to people like, I'm drawing a blank on the name.
In the faith community or in the political world?
In the faith community. He carried his book in his briefcase all the time. I'm just having a senior moment.
That's okay.
I can see him. The fact that he and Dr. Mays.
Yeah.
Howard Thurman,
sure.
Yeah. And it was, he never showed it publicly. I mean, Howard Thurman used to have these mystical moments in the middle of a speech where he'd just look up and be silent for 20, 30 seconds. And then he'd come down with something very profound. And he was not doing it for effect, I don't think. I think he was really opening himself to the spirit. Well, Martin never did that very much in public or on the platform, but he did a lot of meditation. And he struggled for spiritual answers to the problems we were facing.
Yeah. So you're tying this back to this larger perspective. It's a God thing.
It is. And when I went out to this conference and decided to stay, at the end of the week, they were trying to get volunteers to do work in youth work across the country. Mm-hmm. And they wanted it to be integrated, and I was the only Black person there. And so that answered the criteria, something that I could do that nobody else could do. And so I said I'd be glad to. So I volunteered for 6 months, and they sent me to Connecticut. Well, when I got to Connecticut, they didn't realize that they had to provide a place for me to stay.
Oh dear.
And they called the Hartford Theological Seminary.
Right.
And they let me stay in their guest room. Well, I felt comfortable on the campus, and I wandered into the president's office, dean's office rather, and said, "Look, I'm here. doing volunteer work in the churches, but I really don't know as much as I'd like to know about the Bible. I wonder if it'd be all right for me to sit in on a couple of classes in the morning. And he said, well, if you could sit in on 3, I could give you a scholarship. And so I ended up getting a scholarship. When my volunteer work was over at the end at Christmas, I stayed on until I graduated.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, I was still interested in track and field, and the 52 Olympics was coming up, and I had decided I was going to go to New York, and had a job in a settlement house in Harlem, and I was going to train with the Pioneer Track Club in New York. And the conference superintendent called me, and he said, I need you to go to a little church down south that desperately needs leadership. We haven't been able to provide anybody for them for 3 summers. And I said, well, I already have a job, and I'm all set up to be in New York. And he said, well, you know, everybody wants to go to New York. And if you don't go to New York, somebody will go and take your place. And he said, there is going to be an Olympics, whether you're in it or not. He said, but if you don't go to this little church, then there's nobody else but you. And it'll probably close down. See, and that met the criteria. It's something that I can do that nobody else wants to do. Mm. And so I didn't go to New York. Went to Marion, Alabama. And as soon as I get there, I find the family that was supposed to give me my dinner for the first week. When I went into their home, there was a Bible it was a New Testament study Bible, and it was underlined and marked, you know, notes in the margin. And I said, who reads the Bible? They said, oh, this is my daughter. She had a course in New Testament nonviolence in college. And you know, and then she had a senior life-saving certificate on the wall, and I was on the swimming team in college. And she had a basketball ladder. And before I met her, I said, well, I guess this is why I'm here. I'm here to marry this girl. And I hadn't even seen her. Now I did have a course in genetics, and I'd seen her mother and father. So I couldn't have been too far wrong, and I wasn't. But this had nothing to do with her opinion. And when she finally came back, and I saw her milking the cow, I thought it was the most beautiful sight in the world. And I went back to get my camera, and she thought I was a city boy making fun of the country girl milking. And she walked up to me with a bit of milk. She stopped milking, came over to me, and she said, "Get out of my way." She said, "If my mother didn't need this milk to make butter, I would throw it in your ugly face." That was my first words. And but it didn't faze me at all. See, that I was sure I had been sent there to marry her. And we ended up marrying a few years later. Well, he got a scholarship to go to Europe to work in a work camp with the Church of the Brethren.
Yeah.
And I had been working in Connecticut mostly because they needed people. I mean, they were short. They needed somebody to, handle all the books in the bookstore and mail out all the orders every week for people who wanted the books, wrap them up and mail them out. And I was like to hang around the bookstore. And they asked me if I wanted to do that, if I could help them with that. And I said, sure. And they paid me, I don't remember how much, but I ended up with about 4 jobs. And so I had enough money to pay my own way to Europe. I think it was something like $350. We went on a cattle boat,
Mm.
and her sister was in Europe working with the USO in Berlin. And we ended up going to Austria, but she wouldn't let me go into the work camp she was in. She was with children, working with children who had just come over from behind the Iron Curtain. And I ended up building a refugee camp. I mean, a refugee center. I had to dig a foundation 20 some feet deep. And then they didn't have anything but shovels and wheelbarrows. And so I put in, 4 weeks of really hard labor, probably the best condition I've ever been in or since. So it all worked out. And then her sister, we went to meet her sister in Berlin, and we traveled around Europe, and then went back to, she went back to school, and I did too. And by that time, we had agreed that we'd marry when she graduated.
So that whole milking thing worked out okay.
Yeah, and we were married for 40 years before she died of cancer.
Yeah.
And had 4 wonderful children.
Yeah.
But again, it was, well, everything that has happened in my life, it never happened straightforward. I mean, I was pastoring a little church in Thomasville, Georgia, and she loved that because it's the same size as Marion. Mm-hmm. And she was teaching school. And we literally had to almost rebuild a parsonage, putting up walls and putting down floors, built a fireplace, and planted grass, painted, and we stayed there 3 years. And then I was offered a job in New York with the National Council of Churches. And I didn't want to go because she didn't want to go. We were happy in the South. But the same superintendent said, look, I have another young couple that needs a church, and you all have done such a good job of fixing up this parsonage. Really, you're probably ready to move on, and you ought to take the job in New York, and then I could put this other young fellow and his family in this house. We ended up getting shipped out to New York 4 years. And I worked with the National Council of Churches and Youth Work. They were given a television program. So they asked me to be the associate producer to represent the church's position with CBS. And, and I was there for 4 years. I ended up representing the United States churches in World Council of Churches meetings all over Europe and Latin America. And because Gene was also a nonviolent scholar. And when we went down there, we thought we would, they asked me if I would run a voter registration drive. And I said, sure. Only to find that when we announced it, there was a big Klan meeting outside of town. And we had to deal with a couple of hundred Klansmen. But she insisted on, I was still Reinhold Niebuhr, negotiating from strength. So I said, you sit up in the window here with a rifle, and I'll go down and talk to him. And I said, you said, I can't point a gun at a human being. And I said, but baby, that's the Ku Klux Klan. And they will certainly point guns or throw bombs or something at us. And she said, so? I said, so? And she said, look, you're supposed to be a preacher. I said, what's that got to do with it? She said, if you ever forget that under that sheet there's the heart of the child of God, then you don't need to be preaching. said, damn woman, come on. You know, we got to have some alternative for self-defense. And she said, don't you preach about the cross and the resurrection? I said, yeah. And I said, we got the two of us and our 3-month-old baby up there. And I said, if they just throw almost a cigarette on the front of this house, it'll go up in smoke and we could never get out. And she said, so? I said, so that would be the end of us. And she said, don't you preach about the cross and the resurrection? If you don't believe it, we need to find something else to do. And so it was, it was, it was religious extremism on both sides. The Church of the Brethren was a very fundamental, very conservative, but nonviolent church. They did not believe in violence. And it was going to their conferences that they gave me books on Gandhi. And and with her having taken a course in New Testament nonviolence, and incidentally, Coretta King came from the same town and went to the same high school.
Oh, really?
And her house was burned down by the Klan when she was 15.
Wow.
And her father had them pray for the people who destroyed their home. Okay. And but I'm saying that it was a switch for me from just an ordinary all-American viewpoint to increasingly spiritual viewpoint and practice coming from all around me. We ended up leaving New York and coming back to Atlanta and ended up working with SCLC in the civil rights movement.
Ambassador Young, how did all of that faith underpinning all of these experiences that you've just shared, when you started to express a lot of what you did through the SCLC with Dr. King, with into the Congress and the United Nations, how did that all express itself as you got into these environments where at the United Nations every faith in the world, right, is represented there? And how?
But that I found that people of faith, regardless of the origin of the faith, have something in common. And that was one of the reasons I think I was so successful, first in Congress, because I ended up being invited to go to a prayer group and it was mostly conservatives. But every Wednesday morning we had Bible study and prayer. And they called on me to pray the first week I was there. And that was right. It was the day after Agnew had resigned and left the Nixon administration. And I prayed for Agnew's family. And all the conservatives came up to me afterwards and said that they were shocked and surprised that I would pray for Agnew's family. I said, why? I mean, can you think of anything more shattering in the life of a family than to have the father deposed from his number 2 job in the world, in the US? And I think because I took a different approach, I didn't take a typical political approach to anything. There was always a spiritual approach.
Yeah.
And it always turned out to be more effective because it enabled me to get along with everybody. And it gave me an additional respect that made people want to work with me on even things that were difficult for them. If I went to them and asked for help, they usually found a way to give me help. And so it just I mean, my life just seems to have unfolded that way.
I want to follow up on that last story, but I'm struck by how little credit you take for what has happened to you. That it's almost a perspective more of I'm just stewarding the journey or along for the ride. Or
well, that's the way it is, because there's nothing. I mean, for instance, the day before I ran for Congress, I had not thought of running for Congress. And I was trying to get Julian Bond and Vernon Jordan. And I saw myself as a campaign manager and running the organization, because that's what I did with Dr. King. You know, I was behind the scenes kind of running things. He used to say, and I don't know where else I got it, but there's no limit to what you can do if you don't mind who gets the credit.
Yeah.
And so I was always trying to get the job done and not worrying about trying to get somebody else to take the credit. And when there was nobody else, there'd been a lot of people killed around that time, say in 1970. Malcolm X, Martin. There were almost a dozen assassinations.
Right.
And so it wasn't a promising occupation. But when nobody wanted, I mean, actually, I was visiting Harry Belafonte and trying to get him to help us raise some money to keep the Southern Christian Leadership Conference going. And he didn't even say anything to me. He turned around and called his wife and said, see if you can find a weekend soon when Sidney Poitier and Lena Horne and Tony Bennett, and he called a couple of names. Let's see how many of them you can find in town one weekend. He said, we're going to do a benefit. And she said, what for? And he said, Andy's running for Congress. And I said, not me. I said, I want to help other people run. He said, yeah, but nobody wants to run. I said, looks like you got to do it. And that's the way that happened. I was trying, when I finally won and I started enjoying it, then Jimmy Carter decides to run for president. And it was because people were mistreating him. I didn't think he had a chance to win. And I didn't, I thought he'd be a great vice president. But he kept winning. And people kept attacking him. And I would end up writing a little piece here and there defending him. And it turned out that he ends up winning. And he asked me to go to the UN. And, it's all like it's been pre-planned. And it's all worked out.
Yeah.
And so every day, I wonder what the Lord has for me to do today.
Yeah.
And you can never say it like that. People think you're crazy. But I have never known the day before I ended up doing something what I was going to be doing. I mean, I didn't know when I went into Harry Belafonte's office that I was going to be running for Congress when I came out. Hello,
Ambassador Young. Thank you again so much for carving out another little slice of time here. I so appreciate it. I didn't realize the pressure you were going to be under with us having our first conversation right around the Atlanta election, but I should have known better.
Well, it's not only the Atlanta election, it's Colin Powell's funeral, and it's the Braves won the World Series.
The Braves won the World Series.
So none of those could have been anticipated.
Almost like Hank Aaron was looking down on us.
Yep.
Hey, the first time we talked, for the last 30 years of my life, I have been studying at a high level how grown-ups keep growing. How do they make sense of the world? And, there are these big national examples, Nelson Mandela, obviously Dr. King, Abraham Lincoln, Gandhi. There are these big figures over the course of history. You know, you shared with me on our first the first segment of this, so many of the things and the challenges that shaped you, so many of the inputs that shaped you but one of the things that I'd love to get to, if it's possible, is that, you know, in our interactions on the Morehouse board, there was division. There's division on every board. There are different.
Can I start where I thought I was thinking about starting? And that, let me just say that I turned 90. And one of the ideas I've had is to challenge all of my friends to set aside 90 minutes anytime in their lives for reconciliation.
Wow.
And that I started thinking of some of the people that I have had conflicts with, and I never express it. But it, you know, I don't quite get over it. And I decided that that I needed to take some time before my 90th birthday, or in the process of celebrating it, to go back and reconcile with some of the people, and they're not many, that I had conflicts with.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not charging them with conflicts or even confessing how much I was wrong. Is reconciliation is a coming together in spite of. And
wow,
whatever I did, and for whatever reason I did it, quite often it had no problem. It had very little to do with the person who ended up being the source of conflict, or who took the burden of my frustration. See, I mean, right now, well, but it's those simple things. See, that I had forgotten about this, and I asked my secretary, you know, what other information she had, and it's the last minute. She's busy, and we're not together. She's at her house, I'm at my house, and the COVID virus has physically divided us, so that it's more difficult for us to resolve conflicts, because we're not together all day long.
Mm.
and so I said, I wish I had this a couple of days ago. Well, the truth of it is, she did give it to me Sunday. I had it in my pocket. But in the midst of all of the confusion, I was running a little slow. And I feel like I've been running all week on things around the election and the press, and the national conflicts over vaccines, and I was tired.
Yeah.
So I didn't get up time, and that was pushed. That's why I was not here. I usually plan to get to the computer at least 15 minutes before I'm due.
Yeah.
But in the rush, and not being aware of what I was going to say.
Yeah.
But then when I calmed down, and by the time I got here, I remembered, and that's okay. But that process for an 89-year-old is not automatic, and I need all the help that I can get. See, and instead of somebody saying, "Well, I gave you gave you the information Sunday. Yeah, but this is Friday. Tell me right now what was on the information. And then I have to send my wife to get my sweater. Not that I need it, but I was dressing in a hurry and couldn't find it. And she's got a backache. And it's the normal life of every adult.
Yeah.
It's cluttered with daily bits of confusion. Now, last night I had a Zoom call with about 50 interim pastors of churches.
Uh-huh.
And I knew what I needed to talk to them about. And it worked all right. But this slipped up on me. And so I was getting dressed and trying to remember what we talked about before and how I would approach this when, well, I really was trying to go to Colin Powell's funeral. But the weather said that it was going to be cold weather coming into Georgia. And you don't travel from when you've been in the heat and you fly up into the cold one day and then fly back. If you're 89 and you do that too much, you don't get to be 90.
Yeah.
But growing up, grown-ups is not a simple question.
Yeah.
Because we expect everybody to be grown up. And we never stop growing. And when we stop growing, or when we slow down, even, or when we let the conflicts of life disturb us, and we turn in on ourselves, we're finding fault with ourselves, but we're blaming it on those around us.
Wow.
Unconsciously. So that one of the most important aspects of growing up is being able to deal with your internal conflicts in external reality. Because the more you take in, the more you're upset. And the upset, increases the acidity in your stomach. There are physical consequences to emotional disturbance. And like I've tried to remind myself and those around me that when I have a headache, the natural thing is to grab a bottle of Tylenol. See? But it would probably be just as good if I drank a big glass of water. And the headache probably comes from dehydration, especially down here in the South, where the temperature has been 80, 90 degrees and regularly. And you're using more water, but you're not drinking more water. Mm. And to go ahead and complete the picture, the reason you're not drinking more water is that it's more complicated to go to the bathroom in your 80s than it is when you're 18. And so all of these things are inevitable for grown-ups. My father was a dentist, and he used to say, he was a real stickler, brush your teeth, every day, all day, twice. In fact, he wants you to brush your teeth every time you ate something. Yeah. I realize now that, my brother's a dentist too, and he's retiring, and at 87, and I no longer have my brother to run into when my teeth start hurting, and all of a sudden, I've never thought much about dental hygiene except continuing my father's lessons. But the idea of my brother retiring gets to be a real threat. And I ended up having a fuss with his wife. But I wasn't angry, and I didn't make an issue of it, but it was the anxiety over my teeth, his retirement. And she said something to me, and I answered back. I don't know what I said, but it was in a way blaming her for taking my brother away.
So there's a
that's another
parallel
one
there.
on my list. It's another one on my list of reconciliation.
Yeah.
And as I can think through and clean up these things, not only will they feel better, but I'll feel better.
Yeah.
And so growing up, GrownUps is managing internal stress and external conflicts, because the tendency is to take them for granted, ignore them, and not take them seriously. But one of the responsibilities, requirements of being grown up is to take responsibility for your own health and your own feelings. And it's too easy to project them on others.
Wow. Yes.
Say, and I think that's what our politicians are doing right now. Everybody's talking about all of the things that are wrong, and so much of it is due to the fact that the coronavirus has separated us and has kept us from meeting our friends regularly, and it's kept us from going to work regularly. And when you're at work, and you're going to be there from 9 to 5 most days, the tensions that arise in your relationship, you're right there and you deal with them before you come home.
Mm-hmm.
But now you're home and you're not able to leave your work at work. Your work is at home. So you got home tensions, and it's not just you. It's our wives. They are going to the drugstore and planning to make a lettuce and tomato salad, and there's no lettuce. Or there's a shortage of toilet paper or napkins. And somebody says something about the supply chain, and we've never had to think about the supply chain before. Mm-hmm. But all of these external conflicts we're internalizing right now. And so it's inevitable that we have more stress to deal with ourselves, because the normal ways of relieving stress are not available to us.
And one of the things I hear you saying, maybe, but I want you to correct it if I'm wrong, is that we take that internal stress and we almost project it out or blame others or circumstances in ways that is not it's not allowing us to deal with what we really need to deal with.
Well, yeah, because when you have a shortage at the grocery store, you don't deal with it at the grocery store. You deal with it when you come home and you say something sharp to your spouse.
Yeah.
Or you're a little impatient with the kids. See? Or the phone rings and you really don't want to talk to this person, but normally you would talk to them and have a relaxing conversation. But when the phone rings and you're already stressed out, the possibility is that this is somebody else bringing their stress to you, which is usually what happens to me, because everybody thinks of me as their pastor. And I've encouraged people to bring me their troubles, see, throughout my life. Mm-hmm. Now I'm not as anxious to have that happen. And when we just had a mayor's race, and my candidate didn't win. Well, normally we bring people together and reconcile and go on to the next question. But in this environment, everybody's so short-tempered that when I've talked to people about, I don't even get a chance to say it's time for us to come together. They're still complaining about the election. And it might not be the election. It might be the fact that they've been home alone and haven't been talking to anybody. And so this has been a very complicated time of life. I even get upset with the sports commentators because we've gotten to the position now where we overanalyze everything. And it's a rare occasion when a professional team wins a national championship. So actually, Atlanta is going to be pretty good for a weekend. There's a parade now, and the whole city's going to be out parading, probably without masks, and because nobody wants to wear a mask at a baseball game, and you say it's outdoors and it's all right, but then on this morning's projections, that we are so relaxed that we might not be prepared for the winter months, when I've had all three of my corona shots, including the booster, but now I need a flu shot. And I don't remember when I had the last one. Then somebody tells me that there's a shingles epidemic going around, and if you had chickenpox, that I don't believe I ever had chickenpox, but I remember my younger brother having chickenpox, and the chances are if he had chickenpox, I had chickenpox. So I bet there's 2 more shots I got to think about, and I'm saying that life doesn't get less complicated as you grow older.
Yeah.
And you have to be more sensitive to things like, did I take my blood pressure medicine this morning? And how much water have I had? Did I drink the bottle of water that I sit by my bed at night? And this time I did, but sometimes I don't. And so that the regimen of your life that keeps you healthy is mental, spiritual, emotional, and it all ends up being physical. And so growing up is serious business.
Yeah.
And the more you can, well, your curriculum is probably as important, or maybe more important, than a kindergarten curriculum. I mean, we know if our children are not reading, by a certain age, there's a problem, and we can deal with it. But there's no such. We watch how tall they're getting. Here I got on my desk is semester 1 progress report from my granddaughter. And the only reason I got it is she's doing very, very well. And I will praise her, and I'll think about it and call her up. But I had another granddaughter with a birthday yesterday. And I called her twice, but she's on the West Coast, and I never caught her. to wish her happy birthday. But those routine things are more important to our loved ones than we realize.
Wow.
And if I don't get her today, it's difficult because she's working for a computer company and she's working at home and she doesn't answer her telephone all day long. And I think I know how to text, but my fingers don't stay steady, and I don't have any Parkinson's or anything, but still an iPhone is a challenge.
Yeah.
Not just making phone calls, but particularly in trying to text. And so, well, I'm laying out a curriculum for old folks for you.
I wonder,
and using myself as an example, which is what we need to do.
Yeah, to use ourselves as an example.
Yeah, we use ourselves as an example, not to get upset, but to rationalize the things that we need to do and help us to get more organized in doing them, and being able to do it without anxiety or without guilt. One of the things that I think people give preachers or religious people a bad name is they want to blame their religion for their guilt. Whereas as a Christian, I see religion as a religion of grace and mercy, and God helps you through the church and through your neighbors not to carry a burden of guilt. Because when you're carrying a burden of guilt about something, inevitably you're passing it on to those around you. So a good place to start is accepting your shortcomings as inevitable and have a no-fault analysis toward yourself. Yeah, my knees hurt, but for 70 years, I was a runner and bicycler. And it's only been in the last 10 or 15 years that I have any pain. I decided that I'd rather have little pain than to take on the whole challenge of knee replacements. And I live with that and accept that as a decision that I made instead of the decision that the doctors made.
Ambassador Young, you've said it in so many ways. I mean, just from the routine maintenance of being healthy, for people who feel stuck relationally, for people who feel stuck in their position, for all the division that we have, what advice do you have to folks 2-3 generations younger than you to not have this stuckness become crippling?
Well, that's why, my first answer is a church answer. And that is that it's one of the major reasons why we need to accept God's forgiveness. As a preacher, not even as a preacher, I probably became a preacher because I graduated from college very young. And here I am, 19 years old with a college degree and guilty as hell because I know I don't know a damn thing. And it's almost like I had wasted all that educational opportunity. But instead of feeling guilty about it, I suddenly was able to accept the fact that gave me a head start. And then by the time I got to Atlanta and I realized, that Martin Luther King, Maynard Jackson, and a lot of the promising young leaders had all gone to college at 15. And it had something to do with the Second World War, with the veterans in a way. The colleges were empty, and some of them, colleges started letting people in without, after the 11th grade, if they could pass certain tests. I was not one of those. I cheated on the beginning. I learned to read and write in a church-related kindergarten. And when I went to public schools at 6 years old, instead of putting me in first grade, they put me in third grade. And so being in third grade at 6 years old, I was always ahead and always frustrated and always young and restless and wild. But I hated that when I was in school because it made me too young to play football or basketball, and I was good in sports. So I was just too small.
Almost an Olympic track athlete.
Well, the last year I was in college, I literally forced myself on the track. And everybody was surprised when all of the guys coming back from the military, see, were in their 20s, and they had run in track meets all over the world, and they had scrapbooks. And I begged the coach to let me get into a time trial. And he didn't want me to get involved, but in 2 or 3 time trials that day, everything from 100 to 400, if he let me in a time trial, I won it. And so there was a potential there. But I
took you off your story, though. I took you off your story because you were saying you were always frustrated that in getting that education too early, it made you too young, it sounds like, for a lot of high school.
Well, yeah, but it also meant that I had to take seriously all of the social battles. And whereas most young people go through high school and college, a rather relaxed regimen, I was always struggling, with everything. But mostly my teachers and my classmates, because I was younger, I was restless, but I didn't want anybody to treat me different. But then I look back and I realized that all of that was part of my education, and my ability to assume leadership at a young age came from my struggling to be accepted and pushing myself into leadership roles, or whatever. I don't know. I'm not trying to analyze my childhood. Whatever it was, I've decided, well, God knew what He was doing, and it worked for me. Because everything I've been pushed into,
yeah,
I've been able to do acceptably, if not excellently. But that didn't stop me from having a C average all the way through school. But that's what it took to keep you there.
Yeah.
And I there again, I reassured myself, because Martin Luther King got a C in public speaking. Morehouse.
Maybe we're using also the wrong grading standard.
They gave him a C in preaching at his theological seminary, which just means that their concept of preaching was different from what he grew up with.
Yeah. I know we don't have much time left, but when you think about, again, so many people feel stuck. They feel stuck and divided. And I love your thoughts on being separated. It reminds me of Dr. King's speech at Cornell, where he talked about why men hate each other, and ultimately because they're separated, and they can't know each other. But so many people feel trapped in their position and friends in our neighborhood, right? Friends in our church, family members, for crying out loud, that are sitting on different sides of the issue and they can't seem to rise above. And I'm curious if you have a thought on steps.
Well, I do, and actually, that's what church is for. That's what sports are for. That's what neighborhood associations are for. But see, we've been having our neighborhood associations by Zoom instead of with a backyard cookout.
Yeah.
And you don't get the same catharsis because we're restricted by a set time. And so there's nobody plugs in the time of a Zoom call, time for laughter, time for empathy. In the meeting in the backyard or having something in the neighborhood where we're face to face, we're not restricted by time. And a lot of things happen that we're not even aware of them happening. I mean, something that, my neighbor had a baby 2 years ago. And we don't see each other. And for the first time, the baby came over. My wife had a Halloween party for all of the little children in the neighborhood because we have grandchildren that are, 2 to 4 year olds. And so we get to see the kids in our neighborhood, and they're wonderful. And we haven't seen them some of them we haven't seen ever. Because you're not really seeing a baby. I mean, you're just saying how cute. But then we see our neighbor's daughter not only walking but running, say at 2.5, and speaking in complete sentences. So almost like you'd expect of a 5-year-old. And you realize that maybe being holed up with her parents and her brothers has been good for her educationally. And she was one of the most, we used to think of the 2s as the terrible 2s. And 2.5 was when you develop your sense of self and ego and learn to say no. We didn't have a single incident. There were 8 kids under 4, and we didn't have a single temper tantrum. So we didn't have a single kid acting like my kids acted. And I was really glad that we had that opportunity. But even as we had it, we had made sure that all of the adults, had taken all their shots. And now we've got to think about, these children, but not the 2 and 3 year old. But they were in a pretty safe environment, and we sprayed everything, and made sure that the dog was gone to the vet. But it was just being in the presence of 5 or 6 2 and 3 year olds was just a real thrill. So now, nobody thinks that they miss being around their grandchildren, because their recollection of 2 and 3 year olds is crying and whining and rolling on the floor, and but this is one positive aspect of the coronavirus. People have spent more time with their children, and their children are growing up quicker and seemingly smarter. Well, looking for I preached a couple of Sundays weeks ago, and I went back to my old days in World War II when the Andrew sisters used to sing a song. You got to accentuate the positive, eliminate the negative, latch on to the affirmative. Don't mess with Mr. In Between. And that's what I preached about, because I said we needed that positive attitude, because they were sinking ships off the coast of Georgia. The Germans were, and we were about to deal with what was the worst war. But I went back and I remembered some of the lessons we learned to get through that war. How many times would we say from Franklin Roosevelt, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself? And we've been afraid of this virus. And when your closest friends, and in my age group, some of my closest, healthiest friends, didn't make it. And fortunately, I grew up in a family where we were taught not to be afraid of death. And Martin Luther King used to say to us, you're going to die. Death is the ultimate democracy. Everybody's got to die. And you don't have anything to say about where you die, when you die, how you die. The only choice you have is, what is it you're willing to give your life for? But there's no hiding place. And my grandmother used to pray to God that she was tired. She had done all she needed to do here on this earth. She was ready to go on to glory. And Martin Luther King was in his 30s, but he would talk about death all the time, because he said, I know there's a bullet waiting for me somewhere. The way he deal with it, he said, but you all are always jumping in front of me trying to get your picture in the paper. I figured you'll jump in front of me and take it for me. And then he'd start preaching your funeral and saying all of the embarrassing things you'd never once said at your funeral. And you stop and think later, how can he be so heartless? Well, he wasn't. He was dealing with his own inevitability of death, and he was really getting us ready. So anytime we were going into something that was dangerous, he would decide who it might be, and then he'd start preaching the funeral in their face. And saying all the embarrassing things that you would never want said at your funeral. But we were able to laugh at death, and that's one of the things that's necessary right now, especially when I just saw somebody talk about how the curve for the next phase of the epidemic might go in the winter months if it sort of integrates with the flu. Or we was a biology major, so they didn't have DNA when I was in school. They didn't know what it was. But I know enough I know that germs are active organisms that are driven to grow, to compete, and to succeed. So that there's a constant battle going on, even on your fingertips and in your hands. And your body is always trained. Part of growing up is your body training itself to detect the harmful germs and build up defenses against them. And actually, that's what a vaccine does. A vaccine gives you a little bit, just a tiny, tiny bit of a disease to help your immune system recognize it. And when your immune system gets this little vaccine, it runs to it and it kills it, or it does something to it, it disperses it. And so the vaccine is training your body to protect you. See? And I mean, there's nothing patriotic about it. It's medicine, it's science. See, that the same thing happens. I did a lot of travel around the world, UN, and so in fact, I counted, I've been to 152 countries. Well, almost everywhere I went, there was likely to be a different disease. And they would give me a little bit of it before I got there to get my body prepared to resist it. And that's the way your immune system works. So it's worked for me for 8 or 9 years in 152 countries. So, I mean, I'm comfortable with that. But I had to remind my wife that they wouldn't let her into South Africa without taking a cholera shot because she'd never been around cholera. And there was an epidemic going on somewhere around South Africa, but and they made her pay $75 for it, and she was either going to take it or spend a night in the airport, or go before she could go back to the U.S.
Yeah. Is that metaphorically? Is there a vaccine for, I don't know what many would call a kind of an illness, I think, a pandemic of division, and on so many different levels?
There is. In fact, there are numbers of vaccines. I was married for 40 years, and my first wife died of liver cancer. And the last movie we went to before she went into the hospital was Bodyguard, and where Whitney Houston sang "I Will Always Love You." And so when she died, I used to just ride around the expressway and listen to that song until one day I turned on a country music station and I heard the original version by Dolly Parton and Vince Gill. And there was so much more emotion and spiritual power in the country version than the modern version that I started listening to country music. And country music became a bridge to me for all of the anxiety. And I mean, I began to understand why white people who have different challenges than I do sing different songs. Now, the integration of the music, and the last time I saw the Emmys, they had uniquely integrated country western music with the blues and jazz. And that's one of the ways we overcome the isolation and insecurity of being human. Now, the other way has been sport. That they won't just, I mean, everybody in Atlanta is going to be out on the streets this afternoon celebrating the Braves. See, and or when we won the Olympics, it brought the town together because we realized we wouldn't have gotten the Olympics if we hadn't celebrated every ethnic group in the city. I mean, having a big Hispanic community meant that when the Hispanic representatives from the Olympic Committee came to Atlanta, we had a big community greeting them in Spanish and took them to their homes and showed them how we were living. We did the same thing with, well, I didn't know we had a Polish community in Atlanta. See, I just figured everything was black and white. But we had a Polish community that was not only fluent and still spoke the language, but they reached out. In fact, they went out on their own to bring the Polish delegate here and convince him that he should vote for Atlanta. And they told them, we'd be glad to have you bring the families of the athletes to live in our homes for free, so they can see that their sons and daughters in the Olympics. And that was not only the key to our Olympic success. I realized That's the reason why we've been tracking so much international business. So that people can come here and feel comfortable because they're people just like us. And we formed a soccer team. And at the first soccer match, there were 68,000 fans because most of the people come from places where they don't play football. They play a little baseball, but everybody in the world plays soccer. So sports, you can't find a football team that's all one way or the other. Even the historically black colleges are attracting white athletes because they figure it'll better prepare them for the pros. It's one of the things that makes our society successful. And we don't think about it enough. And that's why I appreciate what you're doing with your Leaders Lyceum.
Yes.
And is that we need to do more of this. And we need to do it in almost every aspect of our lives. That we've been quite broad, quite general here today, and that was necessary to, well, I don't know how you're thinking of it, but it's almost like we've been trying to build a curriculum.
Yeah.
And
do you know, I'm finally getting there, but the thread that I hear emerging in almost every story you've told, maybe not the teeth brushing, but maybe the teeth brushing, is that there's a coming together. And maybe teeth brushing in that there's intentionality and regularity in coming together and building those relationships, and in not just being known, but knowing the other differently, perhaps. I don't know. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but
but you are. You're saying what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to say that life develops certain rituals that are necessary for the survival of civilization. See? Wow. And gospel music, country music, jazz, sports, politics. I mean, right now, our politics is divided because we had gotten to a consensus where everybody could be either Democrat, Republican, or we had a few independents who were independent because they wanted to go both sides. Now we had an election that left us divided. And to think of, I mean, Lyndon Johnson was able to pass the Civil Rights Acts because he was able to convince a significant number of Republicans, particularly through Everett Dirksen, to vote for it. But now we can't get the Republicans engaged at all. And I don't know what their intention is, but when I came to Georgia, I voted Republican. When I moved to New York, I voted Republican. And I don't know, I say that it's not true to say I vote for the person, because we're really not voting for the person. We're voting for the issues. And I voted Republican because in the South, in the 50s, because if Eisenhower was elected, the black and tan Republican Party in the South got to have something to say about who the federal judges were. And he appointed people in the 60s. They were all white. They were all relatively conservative. They were all the smartest people we knew. And they happened to be the nicest people we knew. So almost everybody that Eisenhower appointed across the South ended up presiding over our civil rights cases. And we got favorable decisions. we saw that take a switch. But we never felt that we had the judges in our pockets, but we just felt that these were brilliant. These were the smartest men, all men then, because there were no women. And we were the smartest men we knew, and they are the most qualified to decide the conflicts of society. I didn't have that feeling about the Republican appointment. Even Bush's appointment of Clarence Thomas, who I would expect to be sensitive to the issues of the Black minority, but he's never expressed any sympathy in that direction at all. I'm also thinking that they decided to stack the Supreme Court, but I think they're going to be surprised because though they got smart people, good people that they thought were conservative, and they are, but well, I think Judge Barrett went to Notre Dame, and I knew Father Hesburgh, and Father Hesburgh was one of the most wonderful men I knew. In fact, I did Notre Dame's commencement and got an honorary degree there. And when I read that she has 9 adopted children of all races, she's not going to be any rubber stamp for anybody, and that's what we want in our judges. The same thing is true of our mayor here in Atlanta, the present mayor, that she had 4 adopted children. And that affected, one, it made her decide that she'd spent enough time in politics and she didn't want to run again because her children were getting to teenage years. But it also affected she and her husband's savings and investments, because if you're a public servant and got 4 kids to send to college, you're going to need some help. So her husband went to work for Home Depot, and Home Depot made available stock options, say $2 a share for their young employees, new employees. Well, that $2 a share has gone up as high as $200. So if you can invest $2 and get $200, you can send 4 or 5 children to college.
Yeah.
But I'm saying that her reaching out and taking in 4 children that were not her own made her sensitive to the need that 4 children, and it costs $60,000 a year, $50,000 a year to go to college. We have to have a different lifestyle. We have to sell, we have to invest, and we have to prepare. And so
and there's no way to not adopt children and not have a different kind of empathy for people who you previously put in a different category.
Yeah.
Yeah. Hey, I you've been so generous with your time, and I know you surely you've got things on you, lunch at least probably, but as you scan the horizon of maybe even our globe, but certainly our country right now, and you consider leadership, where's your greatest hope? I know it's in God. You've spoken of that before, but is there a movement? Are there people? Is there something you've seen that gives you hope right now for your children's generation and their children's generation?
Well, I mean, when you said, is there something that gives you hope? My grandmother used to sing, "My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' love and righteousness."
I know.
I dare not trust the sweetest frame or something, but only lean on Jesus' name. And I do. I go back to the Bible, and I go back to Elisha. Wait on the Lord. Be of good courage, and he will strengthen your heart. Wait, I say, on the Lord. They that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not get weary. They will walk and not faint. See, and there are enough. I mean, the Bible is a book of struggle, and that verse was probably written just about the time that the temple was destroyed in Israel. But it has probably been one of the verses that has held together a people for centuries. In the New Testament, it's the stories of Jesus. But my grandmother would say the 23rd Psalm every day. Especially the part, yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Mm-hmm. And I think that's what literature is for. Literature of all kinds. They made us learn Rudyard Kipling's If when I joined my college fraternity. You can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you. If you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, and yet make allowances for their doubting too. See, and it's I mean that's what literature is about. And in my times of struggle, I usually find some song, some poem, some book, biography of somebody who struggled with similar issues. And you can't write a book unless you triumph. And my book, the book I wrote about the civil rights movement, is called An Easy Burden. And yeah, and the thing is that I wanted people to realize that being Black has never been a burden to me. I mean, I've always seen it as a blessing. And well, Jesus said, "Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Mm-hmm. See, and my grandmama used to say that. And so I've found that in the darkest hours of my life, like the death of Martin Luther King, the death of my wife, that somehow, one, those deaths are never an end. I would say that my first wife is still a voice in my heart and my life, because we were together for 40 years. Now, since she died, I've been married for 25 more years to another woman. And fortunately, they knew each other. But with Martin Luther King, I was talking to some of his family. And it's hard for them to see this, but I said, your father is probably much more powerful and alive today than he was in 1968 when he was assassinated. That hardly a day goes by when you don't hear somebody quote him about something.
That's right.
You go on the streets named after him, and there's a statue of him. Well, whether you like the statue or not, the impact he had on the South is commemorated. And the entire institution of Morehouse rests a lot on what Dr. Mays gave to Martin Luther King. Now, he also gave similar kinds of gifts to Maynard Jackson, but Maynard Jackson wasn't assassinated. And I would get upset with Morehouse board because this city is run without taxpayer money. I mean, the airport was built with no taxpayer money, no federal money, no state money, no city taxes in the Atlanta airport, because he and I kind of figured out that since there wasn't any federal money and that there were deficits everywhere, somebody suggested to me, and I suggested to him, that we try to go to Wall Street. So Atlanta went to Wall Street to build an airport, and it probably cost, it's the biggest and best airport in the world. It probably cost somewhere around $25 billion. But nobody in the city paid a penny in taxes. It pays for itself. It generates almost a million. It does generate 1 million jobs. See, and it has been responsible for this city growing from less than 1 million people when Maynard was elected mayor, just about 500,000, to now almost 7 million. And we put on the Olympics with no government money. We structured it in such a way that we didn't ask the state, the city, or the federal government for any money. And we generated that $2.5 billion that the Olympics cost us, that we raised privately, probably has generated another $10 billion in private direct investment, because we brought the whole world to Atlanta and they liked it. And now they keep coming back. And that's why we're growing. And that's why the government is collecting taxes that were inspired by the Olympics. But the Olympics themselves didn't cost any tax. See? And that's what my foundation has been trying to do. We've been trying to develop ways to solve the problems of the world without using government tax money.
What's important to you about that approach?
The importance of me is that it's capitalism at its best.
Huh.
And one, to do it that way, you have to be all inclusive. I don't have a name for it. I call it public purpose capitalism. That we define the public purpose, okay? And then we agree that it needs to be addressed, and then we go to Wall Street, or we go to Holland. The first $1.5 billion that I brought into Atlanta came from the Dutch Institutional Holding Company. And they have billions of dollars to invest. And the way they pay for their socialism is by investing in capitalist ventures and making a profit that feeds back into their social network. They have some of the best healthcare, best education. They do things well. Mm-hmm. And they make us pay for them. But they also pay heavy taxes also. But it enables them to, I don't know. But I was awake that day in history when I realized that Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, when they couldn't get money from France to fight for independence from England, they went to Holland. And Holland was one of the first investors, and that's why we have New Amsterdam in New York. Because the Dutch were here in the very beginning, see? And so we welcomed them into Atlanta. And now part of my foundation work is I'm trying to take them along the Mississippi River, because they have mastered the art of living underwater. And Holland, I think, I don't know what the details are, but when all the flooding was going on in Germany and France and Belgium, Holland didn't flood. And I learned that from my father when I was 3 or 4 years old, because they came into New Orleans and they were putting in a pumping system that was not far from my house. And to get anywhere, we had to go around for a couple of years, because the Dutch were putting in pumps that would keep New Orleans from being underwater. See? But they also put in the infrastructure in the Mississippi River. And so I've been working through my foundation with Well, we've talked to 156 cities between New Orleans and Minneapolis. That all of them are on the river. They all have problems with floods. And the Dutch have been helping New Orleans deal with that since 1934. So I've been trying to get other cities to see that this Dutch technology exists on how to deal with water problems. They're masters at it, but they also have money, and so they are willing to invest the money in your city to pay for you solving the problems if you're using Dutch technology, because that's the way they keep their economy going and growing. And well, I have had a wonderful life, and it's been all by the grace and mercy of God. But I just hope I can stay strong enough and healthy enough so that, because the ideas, I mean, the things that make Atlanta run are not even understood by the state. Every year they want to take over the airport. And by some constitutional authority, they are in charge of the city. But this is not a city project. This is an independently financed Wall Street project. And they don't have enough money to guarantee the debt. I mean, the city of Atlanta now has grown to being very close to, well, we were at 399 billion before the virus, where we are now. But the whole government of Norway is just about 400 billion. So Atlanta, it's just the city is as big as the Norwegian economy. Yeah, the city of Atlanta is twice as big. Our economy is twice as big as the entire economy of South Africa. So, and but it's all generated on what I call public purpose capital.
Yeah, I love that. Ambassador Young, the generosity of your time, just sharing your thoughts. There are many of us in the adult development, psychological people who study this for a living that think that you are one of the most important living figures today, and for you to make your time available to me and our audience, I just can't tell you. It's been one of the joys of COVID for me.
But you're giving me a chance to meet your entire audience. Otherwise, I'm just talking to myself back here in this little talk. So thank you very much for giving me the invitation.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Growing as Grown-Ups. Take a second and subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any future episodes, and tell your friends. You'll find all of the goods related to this episode, including the transcript, videos, links, and other ways we can help you keep growing as a grown-up on our website, growinggrownups.com. Growth isn't easy, but it's completely within your reach. Until next time, journey well, friends.